we have everybody's name. That's the good thing with Zoom, as long as people have their name on the screen, because I'm terrible at remembering names. So it's great because I have, everybody's name's there. Unless somebody has a really silly name and it's not their real name, in which case I could call call somebody Cat's Meow or whatever. But so if everybody, I'm going to call on each of you, and if you can just say, the main thing is, why, if there's any specific reason why you're here, if there's any specific question. I know that a couple people did send questions to Liz about some more nuts and bolts, tachlis types of things that we're actually going to focus on next week more. But if you do have a question, actually the easiest thing if you have a question is to put it on the chat, so that way it'll be out in writing. Or if you don't know how to use the chat, you can say it out loud and Liz can put it on the chat. So let's start. So again, just if you want to say, even though your name's there, say your name. If there's anything you want to say about your connection to Haskalah, and if there's any particular reason why you wanted to be here for this class. Stephanie, why don't we start with you?
All right. Hi, my name is Stephanie. I have been with Haskalah for a number of years. I usually attend every other year. It's a whole thing. But this year there's two rabbis, so it's sort of like, I'm Schrodinger's congregant, so I'm going to have to come each year now and stay. I didn't really have a particular reason.
Okay. Yeah. You don't have to.
No, I didn't. So.
Okay, great.
I am curious. My family was Orthodox, so okay. Particularly, we have a particular way that funerals are done. So I'm curious to see. Oh, there's a cat. Curious to see if there are other traditions with Judaism.
Sure. Okay. Great. The short answer to that is it's Judaism. Of course there are, but
yes,
we'll get into that a little bit more. All right, Anne. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a member of Haskalah, but I am of Bris Shalom and actually an associate of KI. And I thank you for hosting this. I'm in my early 80s and I have Parkinson's. So I'm thinking for myself and other people my age. My in-laws, I was involved in them right to the end. One died at home. My father-in-law, my mother-in-law died in hospice. But I see it's not that easy. You sign a will and people want to help you. Nobody wants to see anybody die. So it's very complicated at the end of life. It's not like, well, I'll just tell my family what I want and that's what they'll do. It's a lot harder than that. So I'm glad that there's a Jewish view. I want to hear that. And so I thank you for having this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see, the people keep moving around as they join. Jane.
Hi, yeah, I'm Jane. Been a member for quite a while. And I'm curious for my own wanting to know, but also I'm supposed to be working with Gail on coordinating a list of all the things that are available in the community, and this would help get me started.
Sure.
Because she's already done a lot.
Right. All right, great. And as I said, I did discover in preparing for this that there is, I don't know how accurate it is, but it's in the list, it's in the presentation for tonight, that there is a list of, Jewish cemeteries and the access that we have to them. And I also put something from the Federation website about funeral homes that hopefully is also fairly accurate, but we'll get to that. All right, let's see. Dave, unmute yourself. Yep.
Yeah, hi. I am Rachel's friend Dave, and I grew up with a different faith tradition, so I just wanted to kind of lurk around and learn a little more.
Okay, great. Since you're her friend, we'll go to Rachel next.
I'm Rachel Zane. I'm a former co-president of Haskalah a bunch of times, for a bunch of years. And Jane is my mom. Dave is my friend. We work a lot in the community and with older folks. My parents are in their 70s. So making sure that we're all on the same page as we approach the end of life is really important.
Okay, great. Thank you. Wilma, unmute yourself.
I don't know how certain things work. Like I didn't realize there were like 2 Hever Kadishas. There's one in Bethlehem and one in Allentown. And they work depending, I guess, which funeral homes they work. That's the only thing I can think of. I'm not exactly sure how that works.
Okay.
I guess that should be discussed, basically, rituals,
Right.
on burying. I mean, I know a lot of people who've been embalmed. I don't believe in being embalmed, but, I think things like this have to be discussed.
Okay.
And then the difference in the cemeteries, there are different, evidently, areas that Jews can be buried or not buried. I don't know
Right.
what's going on. So,
Okay.
kind of what's available and various thoughts on practices.
Okay. Some of that will be discussed this week and some of that will be discussed next week, but that's...
I'll be here this week, not next week.
Well, if we're going to do the same as next week, Liz will be recording it, so you will have, if you email Liz, you'll have access to watch it.
Good.
Okay. Barbara, wait, did you already talk? No.
Nope. No, I think I'm the same as Wilma pretty much. I just want to find out what's available, and again, I'm the same thing. I don't think I'll be able to be here next week.
Okay. So if there are any burning issues that, towards the end that you really wanted answered, you can always bring them up. If I feel like, that doesn't fit in with this week, it will next week, then you can get the recording from Liz, or you can be in touch with me afterwards too. Let's see, Sandra, I think you're next.
Yes, I'm interested in the ritual, but also in the midst of trying to figure out advance directives and healthcare proxy, etc. for myself. So I wanted to hear more about that.
Okay, so definitely the advanced directive healthcare proxy stuff is going to be more next week, because we're also going to have, my mind is like a steel sieve. Who are we going to have?
Jenny.
Jenny Levy, Dr. Jenny Levy, who specializes in that and could answer, I can talk more about sort of the philosophical, theological, spiritual stuff about doing all of that, but she knows sort of the nuts and bolts professionally. So we'll be dealing more with those next week, but we will be.
I'm interested in everything.
Okay, good. Liz?
I'm Liz. I'm also the designated administrative director of Haskalah. Been around a little while. And I'm also going through the planning a will, advanced directive, etc., and all that. So and I'm always curious to learn. So.
Okay, great. So the reality is, I was trying to get as much as I could of the Jewish traditions around sort of leading up to death, preparing for death, preparing for burial, mourning practices, Shiva, Shloshim, year, etc., through to Yahrzeit, as much as possible. There's a lot of material there, and I put together a slideshow, which I wanted to put graphics to, but I just didn't have time to do that, and that's not so important. The other thing is, I have to say, and this is on the slideshow, which I will need to share in a moment so Liz, you have to make sure I'm okay to do that. It's from Kavod V'Nichum, which means honor and comfort, which is the national organization for Jewish funerals, burials, Chaver Kadishas, etc. It was started by a former congregant of mine in Columbia Jewish Congregation in Columbia, Maryland, David Zinner, and a bunch of others. And so their website has, I'm very much a believer in why reinvent the wheel. They have pretty much all of the texts on their website. So I put the link. It's actually jewish-funerals.com, but it's on the it's on the presentation. So most of what we're going to look at comes from their website, and then obviously we'll discuss it, and I'll try and embellish it, and we'll get through as much as we can. I guess my other feeling is, after this week and next week, if there are still things that people feel like we haven't touched on yet and we want to, we can always talk about the possibility of doing a third session at another time. So, all right, can I screen share? All right. Hopefully this will work. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, good. So, pointer, in case I need the pointer. I don't know if I need the pointer, but I like the pointer because it's kind of cool. Okay, so, yeah. So, introduction here. There are so many different practices. There's so many different moving parts, or not moving parts, so many different parts of preparing for death, of preparing oneself for the inevitability of our own deaths, the deaths of loved ones, how we treat people, and how we treat them before death and after death. And then, of course, there's the piece of afterlife as well, which I do have in here, and we'll have to see if we have time to get to that, because that's, that can be an entire course in and of itself. Just as an aside, because so many Jews think that Judaism does not believe in the afterlife, which is anything but true. But, it's part of that whole bunch of stuff, to use the technical term, that Christians that sort of fall in the category of, well, Christians really emphasize that, so we're going to de-emphasize it to make us different. And also sort of the emphasis on rationalism and not mysticism in the 20th century. So Jewish belief in the afterlife really got, along with Jewish mysticism, and a lot of it's in Jewish mysticism, sort of got squelched in the 20th century. So we'll try and get to that. But we're going to be looking at general traditional practices, and I'll try to focus on, here's the traditional practice. But obviously we're, as Reconstructionists, but even if you're a member of a conservative congregation or a Reformed congregation, there are differences, and there are even differences from, I'm sure there are differences between Bethel and Brit Shalom in terms of certain practices. It really varies. So the first thing is just to remember, it doesn't just start with, this is, oh, wait, sorry, just visiting, you can't see the whole screen here. Go back. Sorry, let me just, can't see all the way down here for some reason, but you know what, that's okay. You'll all have access to this. So visiting the sick is really important because, the whole process of, when we talk about Jewish funerals, the Hebrew word for funeral is levaya, which means accompaniment. We're accompanying people to the grave. We're accompanying their soul. We're accompanying their soul from this life to the next. And it really begins with accompanying them through illness, through change, through the last phases of life. So even though we're not really going to focus on that right now, it's important to remember that. And I think, we all know that we all do the best we can to visit those who are ill, but it's not just a nice thing. It's a mitzvah. It's a commandment in Judaism, bikur cholim, to visit the ill. That's why so many congregations have bikur cholim committees or chesed committees or whatever. Every congregation calls it something else. But it's really important to be with the person as, in their last stages of life or at any time that they're ill. So I felt like, I didn't want to neglect that, even though we're going to be focusing on really the process of dying and afterwards. So the first thing, so we've been with someone, we've been with a family member. How many people here have been with family members during the process of dying and through the actual death as well? So I went through this with my mother just 3.5 years ago. And yeah, it's a very powerful experience. So what people don't often realize is that there really is a whole ritual around around death, around the process of death. The last thing one does before death, if they are alive, if they are still conscious, and if not, we can do it for them, is the vidui, which is the confessional. Now, you know, in Catholicism, there's the last rites, and other religious traditions have this idea, this type of ritual. But again, the idea is that we should, as much as possible, die with a clean slate. And we've hopefully done that leading up to that time. Not always the case, especially if it's a sudden death, sudden illness, etc. So the idea is that even if we haven't, because let's face it, we all miss something, we all forget something, that there's still a ritual that absolves us. That you know, I don't like using this the concept of it absolves us or forgives us of our sins. It really allows us to forgive ourselves. It allows us to say, okay, you know, I'm dying with a clean slate. My life hasn't been perfect, but I've done the best I can. And I feel like there's been a sense of spiritual healing, and I'm prepared. So there's a whole ritual that involves the recitation of the, now, why can't I just slide it down to the bottom of the screen? Let me see something.
What program are you in?
It's, it's whichever one is Google's version of,
Slides.
yeah. So there's gotta be a way to
Try getting rid of the pointer, Rabbi, and see if that
yeah, let me
helps.
see if that if that does it. No, it doesn't let me go down the screen. It just takes me down to the bottom. It takes me to the next one, and I don't understand why.
Perhaps just leave presentation mode.
Yeah, that does it.
There you go.
I don't know why it does, but it does it. Okay, so we start with the recitation of the Shema, which makes sense. We say that every day. It's the proclamation of our faith. It's something that we say morning and night when we wake up, when we lie down, and it's one of the last things that we say before death. And we have examples of Jewish martyrs going back to rabbinic times, and certainly in the Holocaust, of people reciting the Shema before death. And there's a more detailed ritual around this, saying things 3 times, etc. Saying, which this is, does this sound familiar? Saying Shema 1 time, Baruch Shem Kavod 3 times, Adonai HaElohim 7 times. Anybody recognize that ritual?
Mhm.
Sandra, from where?
Holy days, maybe Yom Kippur or some.
The end of Yom Kippur.
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
same ritual. So again, we've cleansed our soul, we've cleansed ourselves. We're moving on to the next phase. So it's the same idea, same exact ritual. And then we do it again. So again, if possible, the last words recited in the presence of a dying person should be the Shema. And then at the moment of death, those present should say Adonai Natan Adonai Lakachi Hisham Adonai Mavarach, which is from the book of Job. God has given, God has taken away. Blessed is the name of God. Again, this idea that God is beyond our understanding, and that God is present in the death of a loved one. And sometimes we may not understand why someone has died, especially if they're young. And there are things that are beyond our understanding. And theologically, in Judaism, the idea is that, well, God gave us life, God has taken away. Some people find that comforting, others don't. For me, it's a sense of, yes, God has taken away, but not that God has caused it to happen. My theology does not believe that God makes somebody sick or causes someone to die. But when they do die, the soul does return to its source, which is God. So we're praising God at that point. So there is this whole ritual, and there's if they're able to and they want to do a more if they're still conscious and feel like there are things that they want to, confess or get off their chest or acknowledge before doing this ritual, they can certainly do that as well. But it's done by or on behalf of the goses, which is the Hebrew word for a dying person. So how many people knew that there was a ritual like this?
No.
Okay, Sandra, you had a question?
Yeah. Is this confession something that's done to anybody, or just a rabbi, or just you say it to whoever's there?
Whoever's there, or if they're there alone. A rabbi does not, the idea of, Judaism doesn't have that idea of the rabbi as a confessor. We don't need an intermediary. So you're really confessing to God in a way, but what you're doing it with another person, or another person is doing it on your behalf.
I knew that they did the Shema, but I didn't know that there was more to it than beyond the Shema.
Yeah, there is. And not everybody does it. I think it's very powerful. There's actually, I didn't put this in here, I realized, but there's a book by Simcha Raphael, who is sort of the expert on all things death and dying and afterlife in Judaism. He's spoken here, I think a couple times. It's a good friend of mine in Philadelphia, and his wife is Gila Razel Raphael, who's an RRC rabbi. And they put together both a book and a CD set with rituals and music for dying. I used it when my mother was dying. It was really quite powerful. So I realized I didn't put that in here, but I can certainly make sure to, Liz, remind me that we'll have this as, a reference, and I'll have other, references afterwards. But that, so that has some other rituals based on Kabbalah and Reconstructionism and things like that. So it was personally, like I said, I found that very comforting during the process of dying, and then after my mother died as well. Okay, so we did that. Okay.
Simcha Raphael spoke at Shavuot last year?
He spoke at Slichot, I think.
Slichot.
Yeah. So once somebody dies, this is not going to be totally linear because there's stuff that sort of, we go back and forth. But the main thing is, so when somebody dies, who is the primary mourner? I should have held off on showing that. But who do you think are the primary mourners? Who is actually considered a mourner according to Jewish tradition?
Spouse.
Children. Grandchildren.
Grandchildren are not traditionally considered mourners, because the idea is, they're gonna have time for mourning for their parents, but they can certainly, anybody can mourn, but but they're not considered actually officially mourners who have to say Kaddish and participate in the other rituals. Parents.
Spouse,
right. So parents, spouse.
And brothers and sisters.
Right. Parents, spouses, children, and siblings. Immediate blood relatives or immediate relative by marriage in the case of spouse. And obviously in this day and age, not everybody is legally married. That was more of an issue for same-sex couples before, but now it's sort of the same issue for same-sex and sex couples, that some are married, some are not. And so, again, as Reconstructionists, we can decide, okay, so I lived with this person for 20 years, 30 years, even though I'm not married to them, they are my partner, even if they're not legally my spouse. And so my feeling is, and even most conservative rabbis will say this, I think, if someone feels the need to stand and say Kaddish, it's fine. But, some people are a little more strict about that. Again, the idea being, well, you shouldn't really be doing this yet for your grandparents because your parents are still alive. And there's that sort of Ein Hara, the evil eye, that you're tempting fate by doing that, or just that sense of, what, you're going to have time to do this. Mourn personally, but you don't have to participate in the rituals. The other thing is grandchildren are still supposed to be comforting their parents, and serving as comforters as opposed to mourners specifically. The first thing that one is supposed to do upon hearing of someone's death, and this is actually true even if you're not a traditional mourner, if you are in their presence, you are supposed to rip your garment, tear your garment as a sign of grief. Personally, I've never seen someone who isn't an actual relative or mourner do that. I've seen, again, this goes back to biblical times. We read in Job, or we read of also other deaths in the Torah and the Bible, that when they hear of someone's death, they tear their clothes and sit on the ground in sackcloth and ashes. So the idea that if you're in the presence of someone who dies, you're also feeling that deep sense of mourning, even if you're not an actual mourner. So you feel that tear in the fabric of the person's life, which is really what the tear represents. But other people, the majority of times today, people don't participate in kriya, the rending of garments, until right before the funeral. Which traditionally the idea is, even if you're a mourner, if you're not present when it happens, then you can do it before the funeral. And obviously today also there's the tradition that a lot of people will tear a ribbon as opposed to tearing their clothes. Has anyone here ever either torn their own clothes when someone has died, or have seen that done? You have, Stephanie? So that's true, because you came from a more traditional family. How did that feel to you when you saw that, as opposed to, say, is it different feeling than if you're tearing a ribbon?
It's not different for me than tearing a ribbon. And for me, in my family, we're a mixed family, and my siblings are adopted. And my brother and sister did not grow up Jewish, and are not now Jewish. And so for me, these rituals are very comforting. And for me, there's a sense of our obligation, and we're performing our obligation. We're doing right by our family. And for my sister, it was the complete opposite. She actually burst into tears seeing some of these things. Pain. Where for me it was comforting, and for her it was, and she's still, from our grandmother's funeral, which is 15, 16 years ago, is still traumatized by that, the very things that were comforting for me.
Okay.
But no difference in terms of ribbon versus, yeah. I was also a hospital chaplain for 10 years in my first year. And there were times there where we had some very Orthodox people who did, at the time of death, tear their clothing. And that, for me, was, it was, again, nice to see, simplistic sort of way, but for staff was very confusing, Jewish staff. So,
I mean, it's very jarring, and I think that's one thing that's very true of traditional Jewish funerals. There's no glossing over or denial of death, or trying to, make it seem pretty. And death is not pretty. Death is not easy. Death is difficult. Death is painful. So tearing one's own garment reminds us that there is that tear in the fabric of our lives in a way that perhaps tearing a ribbon might not. The other idea being that, when you tear your own garment, you're supposed to repair it, but still leave a little bit torn to remind us that there's always that tear in the fabric of our lives after someone dies. So the other ritual, that if you're in the presence of someone who has died, or the same thing when you go to the cemetery, as I'm sure everybody here has seen, that you wash your hands afterwards when you leave. And it's not this sense that you're dirty being in touch with death. It's not that at all. It's the sense of, you have been in, as it says here, you've been present when a life has left this world. And so it's purifying you in a ritual, spiritual sense, because you're going from one state, from one place, a place of death, into the rest of the world of the living. And so it's a symbolic gesture. you could say sort of washing the death off of your, but I don't know if that language works for some people, but it's sort of just marking the transition from the reality of death into the reality of the living.
I have a question. It doesn't list brother and sister. Am I wrong?
It doesn't.
Sibling.
Parent, sibling.
Sibling. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
All right. My mistake.
That's okay. We're all allowed to have one, no more than one. Okay, so there are other traditions as well that you might not know of. Again, this is as you're preparing before whoever it is, the funeral home usually comes to take the body. Again, these are just all ideas, all ways of respecting the body, closing the eyes and the mouth of the deceased, straightening the limbs, covering them. Again, a sense of honoring the body and honoring the person that you want them covered. You don't want them just lying there. Placing a candle, again, that's sort of symbolic that the soul is a candle, and sort of representing that. Opening the windows is an interesting tradition, and sometimes that's also, somebody will do that, people will do that when someone's dying, because the idea is that the soul is trapped, is trapped in the room. Obviously a soul really can't get trapped, but it's sort of symbolic. I mean, I remember when my mother was dying and she was in a coma for quite some time, medically induced, but she was at hospice at home. And at one point, the hospice nurses were like, well, let's try opening the window because maybe that will help the soul to leave her body. We tried that, that didn't work. So, well, maybe sometimes closing the window, we'll try that. Maybe sometimes if you're in the room with her, it'll comfort her and she'll be ready to leave. We tried that. Okay, other people, you need to leave the room because they want to be alone. We tried, nothing worked. She died when she was ready to die. But still, there's rituals around that that I think help. Again, we're honoring the deceased, but also helping ourselves. So the opening of windows and covering the mirrors, which we'll talk about a little later, which again, that doesn't apply at a hospital or facility, but it does apply in the home. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so the period between death and burial is it's sort of this limbo. It's called aninut, which is an onen or onenet is someone who, it's an in-between phase. And you're not, I mean, yes, you're in mourning, but technically you're not in mourning. You haven't, so if, for instance, I mean, burial is supposed to take the same day or take place the same day or the next day, as soon as possible. Often that's not possible in today's world where people live out of town or whatever. So you don't, let's say the funeral is 2 days after the death. You're not saying Kaddish during that 2-day period. You're not officially in mourning. And yet still you're not supposed to be, you're not supposed to be running around town and just enjoying yourself. I mean, most people aren't in that kind of mood anyway. But you're really not supposed to, so you're in this sort of limbo phase of mourning. As it says in the quote here from the Jewish way of death and mourning, the onen is a person in deep distress, a person yanked out of normal life and abruptly catapulted into the midst of inexpressible grief. He or she is disoriented, attitudes are disarrayed, emotions are out of gear. The shock of death paralyzes one's consciousness and blocks out all regular patterns of ordinary thinking. And so the idea is that you're not, as it says here, you're not even really supposed to console them at this point. I mean, we do, obviously, but, the idea being that they might not be ready to hear that. There might still be, still be just coming to grasp with the fact that the person has died. So you don't focus as much on the consolation at this point in time. So you're not supposed to be, and this is an important piece here. Again, you're not supposed to console the person or focus on the dead person or the mourning process until the burial takes place, which is why the idea of viewing and visitation prior to burial is actually antithetical to Jewish law. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to bury the body as soon as possible, and then the mourning process starts. you know, obviously we know from today that there's often visitation the day of the funeral prior to the funeral and people are going in, but that in a more traditional funeral that won't take place. The family will not come out until it's the time of the ceremony. And personally, I don't know how other people feel about this. I mean, I see the reason for it. I also feel like sometimes it's a burden on the family to have to wait and greet everybody. And there's this sense of obligation to greet them, which is also very much not a Jewish thing. And we'll see that when we look at Shiva, that the mourners are not, there's no responsibility on the part of the mourners to comfort other people or even to accept words of comfort. They're just there to mourn. It's everybody else's job to comfort them. So, and often the reception line or whatever you want to call it ahead of time sort of flips that around. So even though it is nice to see people at that point, I think, you know, I'm thinking back to my own experience. I prefer just going out when the time comes for the ceremony and for the ritual, and then people can come. That's what Shiva's for. I don't know if other people have feelings about that from their own experience. Any thoughts about it?
Having done both directions, with my mother and growing up with a Jew by choice, like going to my grandmother's funeral and having everybody to come up and talk to us ahead of time, and then going to my grandfather's funeral and my grandmother's funeral on the Jewish side and having everybody very much letting us be family together first. And then we said hello and did our, like, the receiving line was almost at the end and not at the beginning. It gave you that time. And I think that really felt more comfortable. It feels like, this is going to sound awful, but every family Christian funeral I've been to feels like we have to be the one that's responsible for making sure everybody's taken care of. Is a weight on the people who are mourning. And then in Jewish funerals, it's the exact opposite. Like, you're not allowed to do anything, and everybody else is responsible for taking care of everybody's needs, not you. So it's almost like, for somebody like me who wants to take care of everybody, neither one feels good.
You have to let yourself be taken care of.
It's really hard,
the mourner's job is to take care of make sure that the burial details are being taken care of. And obviously, like it says, their friends can certainly help with that. But I think, you know, part of what's happened in the United States is that with so many of our rituals, it's interesting, even though in some ways we did things like not talking about the afterlife because we want it to be different from Christians. In other ways, you know, Christian weddings, Christian funerals became the model for American funerals and American weddings, and Jewish funerals and Jewish weddings. You know, I think of, you know, when I do weddings, when I officiate at weddings today, things that people will bring up, they'll say like, well, you know, that really isn't done in a Jewish wedding. Now, the majority of them, I'm fine if people use them. There's nothing that's offensive usually. But I try to let people know what the tradition is. But even, you know, I know growing up, I grew up in a conservative congregation with a rabbi who was pretty much Orthodox in his practice. And yet there were certain rituals that took place around funerals, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that were totally antithetical to traditional Jewish practice because it was following sort of the civil religion of America, which was based on Christian practice.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just about each one kind of makes you feel a little different.
I mean, I agree there's nothing wrong with either one. I mean, I did do a paper in rabbinical school that's sort of comparing practices, and I think the Jewish rituals psychologically, compare it to the stages of grief and all of those things, actually makes a lot more sense. And I think can be the Jewish funeral, with which we haven't gotten to yet, but some of the rituals can actually be more cathartic and there's less denial of death. For instance, especially when we're talking about, there's this idea before burial that tahara, which we'll talk about in a moment, the preparation of the body, and shmira, guarding, watching the body, being with the body until the funeral takes place, is very meaningful. And it's very different than the ritual of having an embalmed, made up, dressed person in a coffin where people are walking by saying how beautiful they look, which in a way to me is about the denial of death, and really antithetical to Judaism. But that being said, even though I think one makes more sense than the other, I'm not making a value judgment saying the other is bad. I just think one is better for us as human beings, if that makes sense. So shmira and tahara are the next thing. So after the burial takes place, the death takes place, again, the body is never to be left alone, okay? From the moment of death to the moment of burial, the body is not supposed to be left alone. And so there is the tradition of shmira, which, I don't know why I put tahara before shmira. Let's see, we'll talk to shmira first. Shmira, which means to be a shomer or shomeret, is to guard or to watch over. Like vishamru, same shamor v'zachor, to shamor et hashabbat, to remember, to guard, to protect the Shabbat. So from the moment of death to the moment of burial, the idea is that, and you'll see this a lot, especially in Kabbalistic sources, but even in earlier rabbinic sources before Kabbalah existed, that the soul is still there, even though it's no longer in the body, because the soul doesn't quite believe that it's not in the body anymore. The soul isn't ready to leave the body. The soul is still present. It knows what's going on, but it's confused. It doesn't, there have been so many stories and movies and things like that. But that's a very ancient Jewish belief. So you're there not only to protect the body, which in many ways was, in olden times especially, was a real thing, because whether it was animals or grave robbers or body snatchers or whatever, you wanted to make sure that the body was safe, but you also were guarding their soul. So the idea is that you're there, you're present, you're reading usually Psalms of comfort, Psalms of healing. So usually there's, in traditional communities, and I'm not going to say just Orthodox communities, because often people will say, oh, well, that's how the Orthodox do it. Like, no, this is the traditional practice. I would say all Orthodox communities do this. A lot of conservative Jews do this. Reconstructionist Reform, less so in the past, but more in currently. I've done it. You can do it yourself. You can have friends do it. You can pay for people to do it. Like from the Chevra Kadisha, you're not really paying, you're making a contribution. But again, this idea is that you're respecting the sacred nature of the body, even though the person is no longer in that body. The soul is no longer there. Number one, the soul is present. But number two, you're respecting that body, because it was the house of the soul. That's where the soul was housed all of those years. So you want to treat it with respect. So Shemira is both about protecting the body and protecting the soul. Again, this is sort of, there's a lot about that in here, which again, I'll make sure I can give everybody a link to this. So now we're going to go back to Tahara. So Tahara itself is really a very powerful ritual. And I have to say, actually, I only recently participated in my first Tahara. I'm not a member of a Chevra Kadisha. Chevra Kadisha, again, is literally a holy society. And their job, what is holy, is that they are the ones who prepare the body, dress the body, wash the body, dress the body, put the body in the casket, and then it's supposed to be closed and not opened again. So it really is holy work. Now, one thing that Wilma mentioned, and I'd have to look into this a little bit more, that there is, she said that there was an understanding that there's more than one Chevra Kadisha in the area. Chevra Kadishas are usually associated with synagogues, not always. So I know Bris Shalom has one, and I'm assuming that the other cases that Bethel also has one. And I know that the person that I did Tahara for from Bris Shalom was not a Bris Shalom member. I believe they were being buried in Bris Shalom Cemetery. I can't remember. But usually the idea is, of course, you perform Tahara for members or people being buried in your cemetery. But if there are other people that don't and they need Tahara, no Chevra Kadisha is going to turn somebody away. And every Chevra Kadisha is a little bit different. I know that in Philadelphia, there was a Reconstructionist Chevra Kadisha, just because there's certain practices that sometimes Reconstructionists might not want certain practices, or, back then there were still some issues, especially in the conservative world, if somebody, well, not so much conservative, it was more Orthodox in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, or if people were, had tattoos, which was against Jewish law, that some more traditional Chevra Kadishas wouldn't perform Tahara. That's obviously not an issue. And the other issue in terms of Reconstructionist Chevra Kadishas, the ritual is a little bit different and there's more flexibility, just as with anything within Reconstructionism. So, but the actual Tahara itself, again, has a specific liturgy that's based in Kabbalah, and we're not going to go into that ritual itself. But basically, the whole idea of Tahara, as I said, is that the body is sacred and holy because it housed the soul. And also the preparation for the body, the preparation of the body, the dressing of the body, and traditionally the casket that is used, it's supposed to remind us that we're all equal. Nobody wears, it's not like, oh, I'm rich, I'm going to wear a silk tachrichin, a silk shroud. No, it's the same cotton or linen shroud. Again, with no pockets, because you don't need pockets in it. It's not clothing. It's a special a garment. Again, white, representing purity and holiness. So the person there's a whole ritual that's involved in. I see it, as we say here, there are 5 parts. First, there's preparation and opening prayers. Again, because it is sacred. So you don't just want to say, okay, it's not a, it's not a clinical thing. It's a spiritual thing. So you want to prepare yourself by starting off with a prayer and to acknowledge that what you're doing is sacred. And you actually ask forgiveness of the person in case you make any mistakes or do anything wrong, or, whatever you want to, so you're asking forgiveness of them ahead of time, basically saying, we want to do this right. If we do something wrong, it's not out of disrespect for you, please forgive us. And again, the idea being that the soul is still around there. So the soul is still there to grant us that sense of forgiveness. So there's the preparation, getting everything ready, opening prayers. There's cleansing of the body physically, which involves use of water and sponges, cloths to wash certain part, wash the body. You really want to maintain respect. So again, this is all in here, and I'm not necessarily following this exactly the way it's written here, because I'm just speaking from experience. There's a men's Chevra Kadisha made up of men. There's a women's Chevra Kadisha made up of women. Obviously today, with people who are being gender fluid, transgender, etc., that's also something that I think Reconstructionist world is probably a little more sensitive to, perhaps, or at least has been traditionally. So there are, so those are things that can be taken into account today that were not necessarily taken account of in the past. So if someone is, well, if someone is transgender, they are a man or they are a woman. If someone's gender fluid, you know, gender nonconforming, you might want to say to them, okay, so if you know they're dying, or even just talking about in the future, what kind of Chaver Kadisha would you want? What would you want the makeup of your Chaver Kadisha to be? And, you know, they may say it doesn't matter. They may say we'd like it to be a combination of people. They may say, you know, there are specific people we would want. So that's something that, you know, again, was not really considered until recently. But the body is washed, again, out of respect for the body. There's a cloth that's kept over the genital areas as much as possible, and also over the face, just out of respect. And then there's a whole ritual with the pouring of water, and it's supposed to be a continuous pour of water. That one bucket you're using water from a bucket, you're pouring it over the person to cleanse them ritually. And before you're done with your bucket, the next person is pouring from their bucket. So there's never a break. So it's a continual process of ritually cleansing the body. So in terms of when I did this, the one time it was at Cantel Milong, is that how you pronounce it? And so any funeral home that has a setup for Chaver Kadisha will have, you know, they'll have the table and they'll have the drains in the floor. But the truth, they have that anyway, because for embalming, they need that as well. But if you go to Cantelmi, they have all the supplies for, you know, they have the tachrichim, the shrouds, they have everything that's necessary, the blessings, kippot, you know, everything, they have it there. So after the washing, there's the dressing of the body in the in the burial garments, in the shroud. Again, you do it, there should be at least 3 people, because, you know, just because you want to be gentle and caring with the body out of respect for that person's life. And so they're dressed, their head is covered, and then the body is placed in the casket. Now, something that I didn't know, and this is obviously more recent, and it was very helpful because, to be blunt, none of us had the best backs in the world, and it can be very difficult. There is a device at the funeral home where you basically put straps under the person and hooks onto the straps, and it lifts up the body, and then you bring the casket over, and then it lowers the body gently into the casket, which I think also is it's not only good for the people who were doing it, but it's also respectful, as opposed to trying to pick someone up and put them in the casket. And then once they're in the casket, make sure that everything's right, then the casket is closed. So again, and one thing it says here is the burial shroud is white, hand-sewn cotton or linen. It's linen. It's designed to mimic the clothes of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. So again, this idea that not only is everybody equal, but everyone is like a priest in death. So any questions about, because there's a lot here, and again, you'll be able to look at this and read through it more, but any questions about the Tahara process, the Shmira or the Tahara? Wilma?
The headgear, that comes in pieces, right? But you don't cover the face, do you? I don't remember.
Yes, there is and there are different traditions that come somewhat from superstition, and I need to look at, I know that the tradition here, the tradition at, well, first of all, before you put them in the tachrichin, in the shroud, there's like an anointing of the body with oil, which is sort of a holy thing. And then I'm trying to remember now. I know that there was actually, we broke a plate and put shards of the plate over the eyes and the mouth, which again is sort of going back to ancient times, you know, the superstition of sort of keeping.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, and I don't know. Actually, I need to look in. I should have looked into that more.
I think that's, see, I had never heard, I was a member of Kadisha in Missouri when I was like in my residency.
Oh, okay.
But I never actually performed a Tahara because no women died. But I went to the meetings on what we do. But for some
Right.
reason or another, I can't remember if the pieces
Right, I'm
actually
looking, as
go
you
over
can
the
see, I'm
head
looking
or not.
here to see.
And I know that they didn't break plates.
Right.
Like,
So here is this is the, everybody can still see this? The
Yeah.
screen? So this is the Tachrikin, so this is the shroud, the garment. This is, you wear a talit, although at least one of the tzitzit is supposed to be cut, again, symbolizing death, the end of life. It's not being used the way it normally would be. The pants, the shoes, you know what? I need to double check, but I think we do cover. I know definitely the head, but I think also over the face. I'm almost positive about that. And then there are ties, so that you're tying it onto the, you know, you tie it so that it's on the person.
But now, do women have,
Yeah.
women don't have pants, do they? They have pants too?
I believe so. I mean, because they're not really pants. It's not pants in the same way that women, you know, in the traditional world aren't supposed to wear pants because you're wearing clothing of men. It's just the two different parts of the shroud. Oh, and this is actually an article here about the reconstruction of Sefer Kadisha. So this is.
Yeah, and I know for sure we didn't break, there was no breaking
Yeah, I
plate.
think that's one of those things that's a superstition that, I don't know where the picture went that I just saw, but if you look here, you can see that that's Rabbi Linda Holtzman, who's a teacher at RRC, teaching the people for the reconstruction of Sefer Kadisha. And that's what a shroud looks like. And I'll have to double check about over the face, but I think the face is covered. I'm pretty sure the face is covered. I'll have to double check on that though. Any other questions about? Yes, Sandra.
I was wondering, in our practices, is getting a shroud something that I should be doing now, or making one for myself, or I just want to obtain it? I've heard people making their own, but what is the real practice that you?
I'm sure there must be people who make their own. I mean, as I said, that like the Chevra Kadisha here, they have a supply of shrouds. They have boxes with shrouds, different sizes, because obviously bodies are different sizes. At the funeral home. So usually that's taken care of by the Chevra Kadisha.
Okay.
I assume you could do it on your own. You just have to know there are certain rules about a traditional shroud in terms of what it should be made of. But usually that's all taken care of. You know, the other thing that again depends on the particular Chevra Kadisha or the particular rabbi's practice. If somebody wants to be buried with something, technically, you're not supposed to do that in Judaism. It's just you're in the shroud and that's it. And there are variations on that, whether somebody really wants to be buried with a particular piece of clothing or with a particular object. Someone a rabbi who's less traditional, who's officiating, would allow that. Same thing with the Chevra Kadisha. Chevra Kadisha might not allow that to go into the casket. But I know cases of people who, before the funeral, even though the casket isn't supposed to be opened once it's closed, often it is, for people who want to see the deceased one last time. I know we did that with my father. We didn't do that with my mother. And so at that time, if somebody wants to put something in the casket that the person wanted to have buried with them, they could do that. But technically, they're not supposed to. It's as simple as possible. And the idea of burying something with the person is really kind of antithetical to the Jewish idea of everybody being equal in death, and also to keep things simple. Wilma, yeah.
How can you see a body after it's been in the shroud if it's not, if it hasn't been mummified? Not mummified, when
Thanks. Yeah. Embalmed.
Embalmed.
Well, it depends. If it's again, this usually should take place within a day or so.
Yeah, if it's within a day or so, you could do it.
Yeah. It's different people have mixed feelings about that. So we have the 5 parts, maintaining the dignity. Again, also was in this presentation from the website, there are lots of different references and things like that. Any other questions about Tahara or Shmira? Okay, I'm just checking on the time here just to see okay, it's 8:05, so we've got, we'll end at 8:30. And again, we might not be able to get through everything, and I have a feeling we might want to talk about having a 3rd session, but let's see what happens. Shmira, we already talked about. Okay, so the funeral itself. Tahara, we already talked about. Korea, the rending of garments, we talked about. Honoring, so those are beforehand. This funeral itself, the delivery of a hesped or a eulogy, either by the rabbi or by family members. There's no hard and fast rule about that. There's some, customs that family members aren't supposed to do it because it's too much of an emotional burden. My feeling has always been it's up to the family. And there have been times when I've officiated funerals where I've ended up reading someone else's eulogy because they can't make it through, and that's fine too. And then the burial of the body. Now, let me just look at the next page here. Okay. All right. So, and some places, the community condolences at the gravesite, and then at the home of the mourner is the meal of comfort. Some places, as it says here, some places today they will have a memorial service later on, and that's often if either certain people couldn't be there, or if there was a cremation or other reasons. They want to have a small private funeral and then have something larger later for the community. But that's a more modern type of thing. And there's no reason not to. It's just not a traditional part of it. So again, the funeral is a levaya. It's accompanying the person. And it's burying a person, participating in the burial is called chesed shel emet, which is sort of the truest form of love and caring. And it's, according to tradition, it's the last thing we can do it's not only the last thing we could do for a person, but it is the most important mitzvah and also the most meaningful mitzvah because we can't get anything in return for it. Other mitzvah, we visit somebody, we do something for somebody, even if it's a mitzvah, we could get a thank you, we could get a gift, we could get a card, we could get an email, you don't get anything in return for this. So that's in some way why it is considered the greatest of all mitzvot. So there's also a sense of the other thing that I forgot is often, and this was true here, a lot of times they will put dirt from the land of Israel in the coffin. Again, since we can't be buried in the Holy Land of Israel, and that can tell me they have little bags. It's like a little plastic baggie of earth, and you sprinkle it into the casket before you place the body. So you're symbolically burying them in the land of Israel. Now, as it says here in the 16th century in Kabbalah, the idea was that the greatest mitzvah was to really be buried to be in contact with the earth, since it says in Genesis, you are from dust and dust you shall return. so and then here it talks about the burial with having earth in the casket. But the truth is, in the United States, you can't do that. That's illegal. But what makes a kosher casket, it's not described biblically because they didn't have caskets then. But the idea here is that it should be plain, unvarnished wood. There are no screws or anything. It's hammered. There are pegs that are hammered and they keep it together. So everything. The idea is that it is wood. It will disintegrate. It will aid the body in disintegrating eventually and returning to earth. And it says here, the Talmud directs that all aspects of funeral and burial should be kept simple and inexpensive. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it's rarely inexpensive. But this coming again from that idea that we're all equal. Nobody should be, the idea of a beautiful metal, gorgeous casket is number one, antithetical to Judaism. Number one, because everybody is equal. And number two, you're putting money in the ground. I mean, it's a waste of money in the Jewish perspective to do that. So here's, formally they would bring the rich in on a dargesh, a tall state bed. This is from the Talmud, ornamented and covered with rich coverlets, and the poor would be on a plain bier, and the poor felt shame, so they instituted, therefore, that all should be brought out on a plain bier out of deference for the poor. And in those days, the body could then be just, the bier being like a pallet, or that the body could be lowered into the grave and literally lying there in the earth, which in Israel, at least from my understanding, I forgot to double check this in here, but I believe in Israel, you are still allowed to be buried without a casket, just in a shroud. And I'm looking to see if that wasn't in here, and I have to double check. So again, in Middle Ages, some places buried in caskets, others didn't. I'm looking to see, to see if there's anything about current day.
Kosher casket.
I think you had it up above.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so in the Talmud, you put the body on the earth itself, but I'll have to look and see. So there are words for a casket in the Talmud, so they did exist back then. So some places the custom was to have them, and some places the custom was not, but it was always a simple wooden casket. I'll have to look. I don't see something on Israel specifically. I'll have to go back and look. But the other piece of the burial is that the burial itself is the last act of, again, chesed shel emet, the last mitzvah that you can perform for a person. So as I said, the idea of someone else lowering the casket, which normally does happen anyway, but it really should be family members. In a traditional family, it would be male family members. Women are not allowed to do that in most, or in at least traditional Orthodox world. I don't know about in the more modern Orthodox world. So you place the casket in the grave, and then it is up to the family members to perform the burial. Really, the family members and friends should totally cover the casket in earth. Now, there are a couple different traditions that are mentioned here. One is that, at least for the first shovels of earth, and if people have seen this, we turn the shovel upside down. So you're trying to lift up the earth with the flat side of the shovel, which means you get very little earth, but the idea is that you're not supposed to be hurrying through this. You're doing it reluctantly. You don't want to be burying this person. And so, at least for the first shovel of earth, you do it that way, so you're hesitating. The other aspect is you're not supposed to hand the shovel to the next person. You should put it back into the earth and then they should pick it up. So, and the other reason also for the at least for the first shovels being upside down is that to show that you're not using the shovel in the same way that you would normally use a shovel. It's not like you would use a shovel in a garden. It's being used for a specific purpose, a different purpose. So you're doing it differently, at least for the first one. And the idea that in, sort of symbolically, by passing on the shovel to the next person, it's almost as if sort of, sorry, my words, superstitiously, you're passing on death. Like you're giving it to the next person, as opposed to you finish your shoveling, you're putting the earth in the grave, then you put it in the ground and the next person comes in. So it also slows down the process, because again, you're doing this reluctantly. You don't want to rush through it. So the idea is, again, you're participating in it. Now, again, there are different traditions. Some people will say you should at least put in enough earth that the actual casket is covered with earth, and then if the grave, the employees of the funeral of the cemetery finish it, that's fine. Others, just symbolically, people put the first few shovels full of earth in the grave. It really varies from rabbi to rabbi, from person to person. But the idea again is that you're not supposed to, you are supposed to be at least participating in the burial in some way. And there's this sort of this tension. On the one hand, you're not supposed to be rushing through the burial. You're supposed to be taking time. But then once the burial is over and mourner's cottage is said, you're not supposed to linger. You're not supposed to stay there. It's like, now that reluctantly we have done this and the person is now buried, you don't stand and schmooze. You don't stay. And that's actually, I have to say, that's a pet peeve of mine, is that often what will happen, and again, I'm not being judgmental, people are people, but I often numerous times have had to ask people to please be quiet and respectful as people are shoveling earth in the grave. People start whispering, but once everybody is whispering, it's no longer a whisper. So I prefer to ask people just to be silent and to pay attention and to be present and to show respect for the deceased.
Rabbi, is there
Yes.
any rule about helping someone to perform this mitzvot? Like an older person? Like if
there's no, my understanding is that certainly if somebody if it's an immediate family member and they want to participate in it, there's no reason that I can see, even halachically, for not allowing them. Obviously, as a Reconstructionist, I have no issues with that, but I don't think even traditionally there would be, as long as you wouldn't want the person to be putting themselves at risk.
Right.
Sometimes you're going to have to tell people, you know what, I'll do it for you. Or the other thing that I have seen is that they'll have a small trowel present for elderly people, so at least they can do it without having to pick up a shovel.
Yeah.
But I've also seen that, where that's all they have. Like sometimes, I always have to ask, in certain places, you have to ask people to make sure that there's a pile of earth there, because sometimes what they'll do is they'll just have a little pile of earth and a trowel so everybody can do it, symbolically. And as I said before, I grew up with a conservative rabbi who was really conservadox, and I never, when I went to funerals as a kid, I never saw a casket lowered. And my mother thought it was horrible when they started doing that tradition, which was traditional. She thought, and the way I was raised, is that the casket was above ground. People would put symbolically some earth on top of the casket, and then people would go away, and then the casket would be lowered. Now, again, with nobody there. That is very much, has been a more traditional Christian American way of doing things, although my understanding is even that's changing. I've heard that from people, and I've also seen on television shows recently that burials of non-Jews where the casket is actually lowered and people put earth in the grave. So I assume if it's on TV, the practice is happening somewhere. But my mother thought it was gruesome, I think was the word she used, to hear the dirt hitting the casket. as opposed to, and again, I remember doing a paper on this in medical school, it really is kind of cathartic. It brings it home like, this is real. This, I think everybody has experienced this. The sound of the first shovelful of earth hitting the top of the casket is jarring.
Oh yeah.
Really jarring. And it's supposed to be. It's cathartic, and it just really, you know, it helps you realize like, yeah, this is real. And I remember when my father died, my mother said, "You are not doing that." And I was like, yes, we are. And the compromise we came up with was that the casket was above ground. The El Valley Rachamim was chanted, Psalms, Mourner's Kaddish. My mother and a few other people left. And then the casket was lowered, and I and my sisters and other people who wanted to place the earth in the grave. When my mother was elderly, and she said, you know, you're not doing that for me. And it's like, Mom, you're, first of all, I said, half joking, I was like, Mom, you're going to be dead. You'll have nothing to do with it. And she was,
Absolutely.
you know, she was like 90 at this point. She died at 92. And, but we did the same thing, because actually my one sister didn't think she wanted to participate in the burial. She changed her mind in the end, but we did the same thing. We, once the prayers were done, we had the casket lowered. Those who wanted to stay for the burial did, and those who didn't want to left. So I think that's a good compromise to have if you ever have that debate within your family. Wilma, you have to unmute.
When the first piece of dirt is placed with the shovel upside down, but as you're burying it, don't you turn the shovel around?
Yes, yeah, the first shovelful, each person, the first shovelful you put in should be upside down, but then you can turn it and do it the regular way. Otherwise, it will really take forever.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So it's really symbolic more than anything else.
Okay.
So again, any other questions about the actual burial? The other thing I should say, both about the funeral and the burial, the idea of flowers is really not Jewish. The reason being that, again, it's a waste of money. It's better to give the money for tzedakah. That's really the Jewish tradition. Now, obviously, a lot of times non-Jewish friends or some Jewish friends will send flowers, and you know, you don't turn them away. Often you can donate them to take them to a hospital or something like that. And I've seen sometimes where if somebody has a favorite flower, they've, you know, thrown some flowers in the grave before putting in the earth. Again, that's not a Jewish thing to do, but I would never stop somebody from doing that. But really the whole thing is you do it as simple as possible. You respect for the body, respect for life, but keeping it really simple. Even keeping it simple though, it's gotten expensive. It's very expensive. And David Zinner, who founded Kavod V'Nichum, this organization for Jewish funerals, talked about this. And I remember when I was their rabbi, this is 90s. Part of the problem is that most cities' funeral homes are not privately owned anymore. They're owned by a conglomerate. There are two different conglomerates that own most of the funeral homes, and I think that's true here. Philadelphia, the two Jewish funeral homes are still owned by the families that started them. So they're in the DC area where David Zinner was from, where was his rabbi. They were owned by the conglomerates, but there was an agreement between the funeral home corporations and the synagogues that as long as you had a traditional Jewish funeral, a plain pine box, tachrik, and nothing out of the ordinary, nothing fancy, there was a set price for everyone. That was much more reasonable than in other places. So if you're in a city where there's funeral homes are privately owned, where the cemeteries are still owned by the synagogues and things like that, it's easier to keep the prices down. But otherwise, there are ways of trying to, negotiating. But unfortunately in America, you know, the funeral, it's a big business. And, you know, I know also having graveside funerals without having a funeral in the synagogue or in the funeral home also keeps it simple. That's what we did for my mother because that's what she wanted. The other thing I realized I didn't talk about with the burial is, so when you reach the cemetery, pallbearers should not, if you are a mourner, you should, so again, the parent, child, sibling, spouse are not supposed to be pallbearers. Again, you're a mourner, that's your job that day. And also just the reality, like if you are in such grief that you are mourning, you know, having to carry the casket is a even greater burden for you. You should be seated watching this happen. Grandchildren are fine. Traditionally, it should be all men. Most non-Orthodox rabbis that I know of, at least, are fine with women serving as pallbearers as well. And again, there's a tradition that once the casket is taken out of the hearse to the grave, you're supposed to, besides the psalms that are being recited, you're supposed to stop 7 times. The idea being, again, you don't really want to be doing this. So you stop and then you start again. You're delaying the burial as much as possible because you don't want to say goodbye. Sometimes people do that, sometimes people don't, but that is the tradition. And then any other questions about the burial itself? I know it's 8:25, so can we go a few minutes after 8:30? Is that okay with people?
I just had a question about the bit at the bottom about the parallel lines and the mourners.
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. I forgot that. So the idea is you're supposed to be offering words of comfort to the mourners. The traditional words of comfort are Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'toch Sha'ar Avelei Tzion V'Yerushalayim. May you be comforted along with all the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Again, sort of connecting it to all the Jewish people who have mourned, and Jerusalem being referring to those who mourned after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temples. And so the way it works is, and I think this is really powerful, so all those who are not the official mourners form 2 parallel lines with everybody facing one another. So you're basically forming a corridor to the cars, to wherever they're going. And the family members, the mourners, walk through that corridor, and you should be silent other than to say that line of Hamakom Yenachem, may you be, or something similar, since a lot of people don't know that actual line, but you're not supposed to really be, it's not a receiving line. You're simply just acknowledging them and escorting them as they leave the cemetery. And I think that's a really beautiful ritual. So thank you for reminding me, because I almost skipped over it.
Are there any other graveside rituals, or do you want to stop there at graveside?
Well, let's we still have about 5 more minutes, so we can stop with the sort of the day of the funeral. And we haven't really gotten to Shiva yet, but so right after, so this is a whole other issue that I guess we'd have to go, maybe we'll do this next week when we're talking more about sort of the nuts and bolts issues about, and you can look on the Kavod V'Nichum website for this also, about why burial and not cremation. Now, most rabbis that I know, non-Orthodox, will perform some kind of memorial service, myself included, if someone is cremated, but there are a number of reasons, both religiously and environmentally and otherwise, why burial is preferable over cremation. But we can look at that some more next week. So again, we talked about this earlier, but this part we can look at more next week, about whom to call, talking to the rabbi, the Chevra Kadisha, I guess this is from the Federation's website, the list of funeral homes here who know how to perform a Jewish ceremony. I'm assuming long is can tell me long.
Yeah.
So, and also the rabbi, the synagogue, and actually it somewhere in here. So again, as I said this earlier, I was not aware when I was first asked this question that we do have agreements that Bethel, KI, and Brit Shalom will all allow members in good standing of Haskalah to be buried there. And Izzy, your name is here as a contact person. I don't know if that's still true. Yes? Okay. But we'll deal with that more next week. And yeah, that's Shiva. I can't find, I might have forgotten to include the Sudat Havra'ah, the meal of comfort afterwards.
I'm not sure if Steve can see it on his screen, but Sandy raised her hand in the participants tab.
Oh, okay, Sandy.
Yes, this PowerPoint or wherever, can that be made available before
Yes.
the next class so I can make notes on it?
Yeah, what I will do is I'll get, Liz, if you send me everybody's email address, or I could share it with you, Liz, and then you could
Steve,
share it?
just share it with Liz and then she'll be able to
Share it.
modify and.
Yeah, okay, so I'll do that.
Thank you. Thanks.
So the Sudat Havra'ah, the meal of comfort, either at the home or at a restaurant, again, having water and paper towels outside the door, again, sort of washing off the spiritual dirt or the connection, the presence of death, washing that symbolically off of you before entering the room.
And what is supposed to be at that meal? Because Rabbi,
Somebody had to go running for eggs.
It's
right, there was a thing
traditional.
about
Now,
eggs.
again, I don't know that this is halachic, but it is traditional to serve hard-boiled eggs. Again, eggs, the circle of life. There also used to be a tradition of hard-boiled eggs that would be like dipped in a little bit in ashes, which is sort of symbolic. There are other, we can talk about this more next week. There's also a tradition of lentils, again, things that are round, representing the circle of life. Lentils, carrots, I can't remember what else, but eggs, hard-boiled eggs, definitely. I mean,
and that at the meal, not at the Shiva. That's not specifically part of Shiva.
that's the
It's
first
supposed
meal.
to be the meal
the
in
first meal
between
after the
Shiva
funeral. Right. That's for the meal after the funeral. And the other
or
thing that's
before
very
Shiva.
important, and we'll end with this and we'll talk about it next week, is again, just like mourners, when you're mourning, you're not supposed to be taking care of anybody else. You're not supposed to be serving. You're not supposed to be asking how you're doing. Other people are supposed to be taking care of you. Also true at the meal after the meal of comfort.
You're not supposed to plan that.
Hmm?
Are you not supposed to plan that either?
You're not supposed. The mourner is not supposed to plan anything. That should be planned by friends or children of the mourner. Again, children of the mourners, not children of the deceased, because they're mourners. But say like the grandchildren or the really the people who are actual mourners should not be the ones planning the
Mourners mourn.
the anything at all. Now, often they end up being, because if they're a small family and if the synagogue doesn't have a committee to do with that, I don't know exactly what Haskalah has. I know Brit Shalom is pretty good at that. But again, it's a bigger.
You're looking at it, Steve. It's
I had
usually
a feeling.
Mom
I
and
mean, that's the problem with the smaller shul, that you have that issue.
And we didn't know about the hard-boiled eggs and lentils, which is why we had to run out and get them at one point.
Right. Not everybody does lentils, but everybody does the hard-boiled eggs. I mean, traditionally does the hard-boiled eggs. So again, we can go through more of those details too. And the website, the Kavod V'Nichum website, has all of that. They have a lot of information there. Not just what I put on the PowerPoint, but more than that. But even, with Shiva, which we'll talk about more next week, I mean, you're really, the traditional Shiva, which we'll look at some of the texts, you're really, besides the fact that you're supposed to be sitting on a stool, on the ground or on a stool, because that's, again, the ancient practice of sitting on the ground when you're in mourning. but the mourner is really not even supposed to say anything. And you're not supposed to make idle chatter or anything. You're supposed to just go up to the person, maybe sit with them, offer them words of comfort, and then leave. No food, no gifts, no none of that. Now, obviously, that's changed, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. But I think it is important, even if you are serving food at Shiva and all of that, that it's not a party, and that, but more than that, just that if you are doing that, then it should be other people's job to take care of all that and not the mourner. All the meals should be provided for the mourner during Shiva. Sometimes, again, depending on how long you do Shiva, whether it's 3 days or 7 days, usually, hopefully there's somebody to help coordinate, like who's bringing food or who's buying food for this meal. And the idea is supposed to be taking care of the mourner during this period. But I think we're at 8:30 at this point. Any other last minute questions that are burning that I can either answer now or we can leave for next week? All right, so next week what we'll do is, I know Jenny was going to be here next week to talk about the sort of the advanced directives and things like that. So my feeling is we might not get to the stuff on mourning, on Shiva, Shloshim, and all that, but let's see how things go next week, and then we can talk about if people want to do if we want to do a third session as well. Does that sound good?
I know Jenny's run a couple of Shiva minions for the congregation because of us being lay-led as often as we are, so that
Right.
She might be able to speak to that too.
Yeah, that's true. But my concern is that all the other questions about the end of life stuff, and that's going to take up so much time that we might not have time for anything else. But I know that I'd already talked to her about doing that next week. So we'll definitely do that next week. And then if there's time to continue with Shiva and things like that, we will. And if not, then we'll talk about possibly a third session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rabbi. You covered a ton.
And if anybody has any questions they want to relay to Steve, just send them to me.
Yeah, or you can just send them to me too. It's just rabbisteve@gmail.com. But I will share this with you right now, Liz, so you can share it with people. Okay.
There I am.
All right. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. Take
And I'm
care.
gonna stop recording.
Bye.